Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. India's growth has been very solid over the past 4 years. IMF's Chief Economist Maurice Obstfeld on Sunday said praising the fundamental economic reforms like the GST and the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code carried out by the government. Summing up his impression of India's economy in the last 4.5 years of the Modi government, the top IMF economist said that the country's growth performance has been very solid, noting that there has long been a legacy of corporate debt associated with bad infrastructure projects in India. Obstfeld said it has been very concentrated in the banking system. However, with an upcoming election in the country, there is reluctance to do anything that would slow the economy, the economist said, observing the lesson of experiences is that financial vulnerabilities can go south very quickly. Maurice Obstfeld who is set to retire this month end, will be succeeded by Gita Gopinath, the second Indian to be appointed to the position. Former RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan had served as Chief Economist of the International Monetary Fund. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze India's growth story. Joining me on the program today are R. Gopalan, former Secretary, Financial Services, Ministry of Finance; Ajay Dua, former Secretary, Ministry of Commerce and Industry; and K. Badrinath, Policy Editor, Financial Chronicle. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Mr. Dua, I'd like to begin with you. What have the growth drivers been?
Last 4 years, we've seen fairly good monsoons, which has helped the agriculture growth pick up. And as we all know, good agriculture has a fair amount of backward and forward linkages. So that's built up some demand in the economy, reflected in recovery of the manufacturing sector, and of late even recovery in exports. Services has grown, but probably not so much as in the past, because in the services sector we are fairly export driven. And if the global economy doesn't keep pace with, or our importers don't keep pace with our production of services, or our ability to produce the services, that impacts. So I would say that 7% plus rate of growth which we've seen, 7.1, 7.2, is under the conditions a fairly good rate of growth.
Right. Mr. Gopalan, what steps has the government taken over the last 4 years so as to ensure that growth has been steady?
Okay, there have been various steps which included both structural as well as, kind of looking at the trends and how to see that the trends look better as we go along. Before that, to come to Mr. Dua's point, consumption was one of the big drivers of growth in the last 4 years as we look at it. Export did not do so well. Gross capital, fixed capital formation is inching up, but it is not nowhere what it was earlier. So basically the growth has gone through consumption route more than the investment route. So this is something which we need to correct as we go along. And as far as the sectors are concerned, supply side is concerned, well, agriculture has had a roller coaster kind of growth. Manufacturing has been falling, industry has been falling, but manufacturing has been falling a little bit. Services has been maintaining it as it were in a static kind of a way. So we need to look at, for the future, lessons for the future will be that we look at how to get in more investment into the economy so that the growth will be a sustained kind of a growth. That's what I would say about the economy, how the economy has grown.
Right. Badrinath, how do you look back at the last 4 years and India's growth story as a financial journalist?
I tend to disagree with Mr. Dua.
Good.
Because if you think that it's agriculture-led growth, then what are you talking about agrarian distress? The entire country, if you have seen in the last 2-3 years, there have been at least 100 big rallies with farmers coming onto the streets. So if agriculture has led the growth, how is it that we talk about agrarian crisis? So my suspicion is possibility, yes, there might be certain islands of growth in agriculture, a few islands. And secondly, the industry again is not that across the spectrum there has been growth. There could be some areas like Mr. Gopalan was pointing out about some areas where sectors where there has been growth. Services, definitely we could have done better because of the global matrix that is not doing very well. First 2 years it was good, and after that last 2 years has not been very good in terms of demand for services, and also the kind of services that we provide and the kind of services that has been sought by the global community with a lot of other things coming in, artificial intelligence and things like that. We have to go up the value chain. So this part perhaps is still unclear. Is it sustainable at all? Even 7% is a big question mark.
Right, Mr. Dua.
A good point Badri is raised. The question is the distress amongst the farmers, something which is now pronounced. It's largely because of the prices not having risen. The agriculture prices, which again also get reflected in terms of agriculture wages. If you look at it, we've seen higher production. Just to give you an example, we've been talking about Madhya Pradesh for so long. Madhya Pradesh during the last 15 years has experienced one of the highest double-digit rates of growth in agriculture. Yet, most pronounced agriculture distress was, ever since the Mandsaur firing last year, was in agriculture, and people think that that could probably go against the incumbent government. The fact of the matter is, farmers have probably produced more, but the marketing for it wasn't commensurate, and that has led to lowering of the price income. Having said that, the fact of the matter is that has enabled agriculture's food inflation has been contained. Containing of food inflation has had such positive effects on the rest of the economy. You've seen rates of interest rates being kept low because the inflation is low. Otherwise, if you recall 4 years ago, Frank, we were in a stage where inflation was double digit. And now, for the last 4 years or so, we've seen inflation being range bound. And going forward, actually there was, in the last MPC which was held last week, there was, with inflation in the bracket of 2.7 to 3.2%, there was a strong case for bringing down the rates further.
Yeah.
So that is where I said that if enough food hadn't been produced in the country, if there wasn't enough agriculture production, we would not have seen the positive aspects which we have seen elsewhere in the economy.
So there was a spilling off effect is what you're
absolutely,
suggesting, yeah.
But that's one. I think the point which you earlier talked about is that what is it that has happened in the economy, which the chief economist, the retiring outgoing chief economist talked of
IMF,
he's talked about two things positive. One is the GST. I don't think anyone can dispute that. GST was work in progress for last 12 years, 2003 actually. So by the time it happened, it was 14 years. Everybody must get credit for it, including those who had opposed its coming at one point of time, states which had opposed it, the parties which had opposed it, now saw the merit in it and let that be passed. It's a different matter that there was disruption because enough preparation hadn't been made before introducing it, so there was a temporary glitch.
But we all knew it was work in progress.
Yeah, what I would like to emphasize and put it on the table for discussion by my colleagues is the IBC. How something which he's highlighted, how positive it is, and particularly if you relate it to what is the level of lendings which have been made to the organized sector, which is now coming, most of it is accounts for the IBC defaults or the 10.5 lakh crores defaults, and whether the process has worked, whether the time limits which were prescribed 270 days, whether those have been adhered to, because as far as I know, of the 12 cases which were referred by the RBI, only 2 out of those 12 have actually met the 270 days. Most of the rest are still work in progress.
Right.
And second, the recovery level under the IBC has been 26%. Might appear high compared to what it was before, but whether 26% itself is large enough, and then the various glitches in terms of late bidders, courts coming in and then saying that in order to realize the full values, promoters definition with some people section 29 of it, which was amended once, whether that is restrictive or something else needs to be done.
Right. Yes, Mr. Gopinath.
No, he has covered quite a lot about IBC and GST. I don't want to make the point there. What Badri was mentioning about the agrarian distress is a fact. There is no hiding from that. Possibly, you see, the prices had not kept pace with the input costs. That is one thing which was there. Second, the insurance was very good scheme introduced, but the administration of that needs to really tone up to get the benefits reach to the people, and open the markets for people for the agriculturists to get the better prices. Now, without that, obviously somewhere it gets stuck, and which gets manifest in the form of asking for a loan waiver. So that's where the problem is. So unless these things are handled, agriculture is, let us understand, both the farm and non-farm, they hold close to about 60% of the population are under that. Unless we settle that in a meaningful way, other things will have a problem. Okay, good things are, once again, Swachh Bharat. People don't understand the implications of it. That's a very good thing which is going to come about. And the Ayushman Bharat which they have introduced, that is going to be another good thing which is going to happen. Make in India, though the contours of Make in India are not clearly visible to the people outside, lot of work is going on, but it needs to really manifest itself in terms of output. And lastly, people should not forget this. This government has, on the fiscal deficit, it has maintained in a very probably a good level, so that the runaway this thing of a fiscal deficit operating on other issues are not no longer going to be there. I think by and large there are a lot of good things as we.
Right. Yeah, you have a big smile on your face. Go ahead.
Point here is, okay, we are happy that there is 7% plus growth, but then is it inclusive or not is the biggest question. When I talked about agrarian crisis, this is the primary issue that I am talking about. We are happy that prices are low, we are happy that inflation is low, but then at whose cost? Can't we see people throwing away onions on the streets? And even yesterday, one farmer from Maharashtra, sir, from your state, has money ordered just 1,040 rupees for 756 kilos of onions. They may be seen as isolated.
About the country's fiscal target.
They may be seen as isolated incidents. But point here is that, okay, 7% plus growth, I am also happy about it. Full credit to this government. But then, is it inclusive? Is the benefits of all this growth going to people whom we think who should be the beneficiaries? He talked about the prices. Okay, if we don't get the right, even 10 rupees per kilo, you and me pay 30 rupees in the market, and the farmer doesn't get even 10 rupees. And then that means somewhere the system is not right, where I am not able to provide even 10 rupees for the farmer who tills his land for the entire year. There are systemic issues. But then if we think, are we happy with just growth at 7% plus, or is it inclusive, fully widespread, and are jobs being created, and is it at all that the benefits of prosperity that we are talking about, the India growth story that the World Bank IMF chief talks about, is it going down the line or not? Is a big question that needs to be addressed.
Okay, I think that, let's try and address that question as well. Okay, Mr. Dua, 7% growth, shouldn't we be aspiring for more?
Certainly, there can be no two views about it at all, particularly because we've seen the trickle-down effect in India. Our policy approach to economic development still is dominated by, growth, and then the poor benefiting from it through a trickle-down rather than bottoms up or welfare schemes oriented. That probably needs to be in double digit if we have to see the inequalities of income and wealth reducing by any significant sense. The question is, we seem to be, I think I would tend to agree with what Badri is saying, but it's a much longer term issue to handle. It's very easy to say let's reboot all our policies. To what extent is it possible? In the context of a federal democracy, states' ambitions, center having to worry about a whole lot of things. I'm not holding a brief at all about the government, but saying you have to start making changes. The changes, I see a good aspect because it will allow banks to start lending again, a process which was coming to a halt. But what we got to be seeing is all our credit to the farming sector is just 10.5 lakh crores and our NPAs largely coming from the organized sector, maybe 200 defaulters in it, is also 10.5 lakh crores. What kind of employment does the agriculture create? What kind of linkages does the agriculture have forward and backward to the economy, and what these 200 large borrowers have contribute, and is going forward that way, or we need to look at our entire lending policy. Just to give one figure, agriculture got last year 5% of the total bank lending. Within that, only 40%, that means 2%, has gone to farmers who have borrowed less than a lakh of rupees. That means basically small farmers. The banks also, they might be, in order to meet their priority sector lending, they did about 16% last year as against a target of 18. In that 16%, there is a fair amount which has gone to the large farmers, fair amount which has gone to fertilizer producers, warehousing, agriculture related, but the share too of the small farmers, which should be growing, and we certainly worry about debt waivers because they come about repeatedly.
Right.
But we are not so worried about this 10.5 lakh crores with the 200 odd businessmen. So that is some kind of a thing which we need to do. And I would just end on this agriculture saying whole lot of things need to be done.
Right.
And unless we do it, our 7% plus or higher figures will not be sustainable. The base has to be strong if you have to get your economy going upwards.
All right. Mr. Dua is suggesting that the base has to be strong if you have to ensure that 7% plus growth is sustainable. My question to you, Mr. Gopalan, is what needs to be done really going forward so as to ensure that we can boost this growth?
Okay, let's look at certain sectors like we have export as one sector. Now in export, what we find is that we are all looking into traditional labor oriented kind of exports. Now our value addition in exports has really not picked up so much. Now we are importing quite a lot of electronic components. We don't have a facility for making the fabs in this country, and from there the chips and all those things which will flow, we don't have that facility, and those kind of things we should focus on. One. Two, in all other value additions in chemicals or in engineering, those kind of exports, we need to look at how we can introduce value so that we are able to have a sustained export market, because on the labor oriented export sector, we are facing a lot of competition from a large number of countries. One. Two, labor loss is something which we need to willy-nilly bite the bullet. You can take a very slow kind of process. I know that that's a very vocal kind of a sector, but if you are going to have laws which are very, very inflexible, possibly you won't have more employment. Though there are some people who say that if labor is organized, they have a protection, obviously they will do better. That's one way of looking at it. Then third, your SME sector. Now we need to, the entire ecosystem for SME sector has to be pushed up. You see, you have not enough that you supply more credit. What about their HR management, their their production facilities, cluster formation for their production facilities to really go up, and technology infusion, like technology, textile technology modernization, those kind of infusion of those kind of aids to this sector. Unless we are able to attend to that sector holistically, there is no point in asking that more credit should flow into the SME sector. So that's one area which 40% of our 45% of our manufacturing is taking place, 40% of export is taking place. Unless we attend to that sector, we will not be in a position to kind of look at. And lastly, the non-farm growth, this non-farm sector growth is something very crucial. Now for them to progress or flower, the kind of credit growth to those sector is something which has got to be looked at. Now sporadically it is being done. The MFIs are there are some self-help groups are there, but then the credit from the organized sector to this non-farm sector has to really grow. Right. All these things will really take structurally will create a transformation. Apart from the IBC and GST which he has indicated, formalization would take place, certainly has taken place, it is increasingly taking place. So all these things holistically should push the economy on a really path which is more than 7.5 plus.
All right. Yes, Mr. Dua, you want to add something?
We are not basically a large trading economy. We are a domestic driven economy. All those things about exports, etc. have to be done. But that apart, to the extent possible, what we need to be addressing is that in India, a very large portion of the GDP and employment is created by what he referred towards the end. It's the unorganized informal sector. We are certainly not doing enough about it in any aspect. I would say if the growth has to be inclusive, if the base has to be strong, and then the pyramid building, we need to do far too much. Rather than consider these hawkers as a pest, rather than consider slums or informal settlements as something which needs to be destroyed in order to make it fall in line with your urban planning, urban laws, etc. We have to be looking at how to formalize them, how to get the maximum out of them. Industry is not going to be absorbing your labor. Right. These people have to stay where they are. Modes of employment, modes of capital formation for them need to be done, and I think that requires a total change in mindset rather than looking at a sector which is 16 manufacturing. I've been involved with manufacturing for a long time, so has he been. Fact of the matter is that manufacturing is 1/6 of your economy. Right. The services, yes, services have huge backward linkages, exports, etc. also come in. But the fact of the matter is that employment is getting created in outside the formal sector of the economy. Sure. And if you want to go forward, think differently how to legitimize them, how to make them grow, rather than saying that they will all benefit when manufacturing improves, or they will all benefit when the exports go up. All right. K. Badrinath, what are the biggest challenges for growth going forward, and how can these challenges be addressed?
See, challenges are known. Basically, the issue is that we are not going beyond our cities. So, if the growth has to happen and is to be sustainable, as Mr. Dua did refer to that issue, that it should be bottoms up. Otherwise, unless you have cluster-based approach to the spreading prosperity across, it is not going to be sustainable, in the sense that it should be rural, it should be semi-urban, and it should be spread across, skill oriented, and more human resource oriented. That is towards manufacturing and agriculture. Towards industry, it is to be, and services, it has to be technology oriented. Unless these two combined approaches are not taken, my guess is this 8%, 10% doesn't make much of a difference. Yes, we are a wealthy country, we are $2.2 billion plus economy and all that. But then ultimately at the end of the day, if 660 million people do not have $1.6 a day income, then what does that translate to is the big question. So the bottoms-up approach that Mr. Dua was talking about is the only way out. It cannot be always trickle-down theory that we go ahead with.
All right. Yes, Mr. Gopalan, you wanted to add something?
I want to make another point which is very important is infrastructure, which we didn't, for want of time, none of us have mentioned, but that's an area which encompasses everything, and that's a basic thing which is required for the economy to really grow on a sustained growth level of 7.5 plus. The infrastructure in power, in roads, in ports, in wherever you talk of, unless that gets a leg up, that has got to come out of its difficulties, where whatever is required sector-wise problems to be tackled, efforts have to be taken to get that done very clearly. And lastly, he alluded a little bit but did not go beyond a point, is on the skill development, which is something which is very, very crucial for a variety of jobs in this country to pick up the productivity. That is very much required. Work is going on, but it needs to be scaled up phenomenally to ensure that we are able to get the right kind of technically capable manpower who would be in a position to deliver what is required for this kind of a growth.
All right. Mr. Dua, close the show for us with your concluding remark on the best way forward.
Yeah, the chief economist at the IMF, we must appreciate his munificence towards India. He's talked about the positive things, but what we didn't talk about was he's also alluded, and I wouldn't just say alluded, talked about it, saying the problems of the NBFC sector, those have emerged and those are growing. The government will need to be working towards regulating those. Otherwise, the problems of the banking sector, NPAs, bad loans, and all the kinds of liquidity issues are just getting transferred to NBFCs. And NBFCs in India, as particularly ever since the banks got into a bit of a problem, have grown quite a bit. Their problems, we've just seen one instance of ILFS, 90,000 crores plus. Similarly, there could be many more. The way forward would be to include them in our scheme of lending, our scheme of liquidity, and make sure that they continue to play a supportive role, whether it is in infrastructure building, a very important point, because infrastructure in rural areas in particular has to be built by the government under the PPP mode, etc. It cannot come up. It will come up where the users of traffic are. That's largely urban. So growth coming from, help coming from NBFCs is as important as elsewhere, and I would look forward to that.
Is double-digit growth achievable?
Yes, sir. I am very confident on that. We can do it. We have at times recorded 9% already. And in fact, for a 2.5 years,
I think there should be two opinions about
average 9% plus for 2 years.
Right.
So that is possible, and I think, as the base becomes larger, it will always become more challenging.
Right.
But it is not beyond us to do it, because we are still just a $2.5 trillion economy. If we are talking of our $5 trillion economy in the next 4 or 5 years, you need to be in the double-digit growth.
All right. On that note, then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it on this edition of The Big Picture. See you again next time.